Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's helpful to recall William Faulkner's admonition this turbulent year when we hear so many echoes of a half-century ago, 1968, ripe with tumultuous events. Two of the most horrific were the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy 8 weeks apart. Had they lived, many hoped they would have worked together as friends, solving pressing issues of social justice and poverty. But a new book tells us they were never friends. They weren't close. They rarely spoke. The Promise and the Dream is the latest study from veteran journalist and longtime Vanity Fair contributor David Margolick. He'll help us understand just how complicated was the relationship of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Next. David Margolick, good to see you here. And what an engaging and mind-bending book this is. I mean, the long and winding roads you chart in this book are fascinating, among other things. You talk about Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy being linked as no other black man and white man in the history of civil rights. Why was that? Were the people who linked projecting?
Well, I think really it's almost by the process of elimination. I mean, the races were so stratified and so separate at that point and prior to that point in American history that there are very few pairings of white and black leaders in this country. There's not much competition in that regard. I mean, really the only competition is Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in a way, you know, who had a complicated relationship and knew one another and met one another and interacted. I'm just reading a book about that now. But after that, and for the next 100 years, the communities were really separate. Booker T. Washington went to the White House at the invitation of Theodore Roosevelt. That's really almost the only other instance where two prominent leaders, white and black, actually rubbed up against one another until Bobby Kennedy and King came along. So there's not much competition for that distinction.
The projections or the hopes or the wishes for something like that to happen, that the two could unite, ignores, as your book makes clear, that these guys were very different private men than they were public.
Well, that's right, and they were very different from one another, and they were very, very different temperamentally. I mean, there are very few people who actually knew them both. And the book is based...
And not many still around.
Yeah, not many still around. And it was very precious to find people who actually witnessed their interactions or were intermediaries between the two of them, precisely because, as you say, they didn't have that many direct interactions themselves. I mean, there's no correspondence really between them. They didn't pick up the phone very often and talk to one another, and it was usually during crises, during the freedom rides and other crises during the civil rights movement.
And as you point out, it's almost impossible to find a picture of the two of them together where they're not in a crowd with other people. And you say that wasn't an accident.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was one of the most striking things I found at the very beginning. This book was originally going to be a photo book with a little bit of writing from me. And of course, as I got into it, as any writer would, I was, writing more and more and researching more and bumping photographs left and right. And one has to explain why. I mean, in a way, a journalist or a historian sometimes has to explain the absence of things, because obviously that was no coincidence. And as I explain in the book, it was because the Kennedys were very practical political people. King was practical, but he was also a spiritual man. Nobody ever accused the Kennedys of being spiritual.
No.
And it was one of the things that separated these two men. And for the Kennedys, Martin Luther King was radioactive. The Kennedys didn't want to antagonize white voters, and they kept their distance from him publicly. And that's the reason there are no pictures of the two of them together.
And, of course, we're hearkening back to the Kennedy campaign, John Kennedy campaign, in which Bobby ran.
Right.
And how radioactive they felt Martin Luther King was is illustrated many times in your book. But I'm thinking of a particular incident when Martin Luther King was arrested on a trumped-up something in Georgia and thrown in jail.
A parole violation. Thrown into a penitentiary.
And I think it was only a month before the election.
It was only a few days before the election.
And Jack calls Coretta King and to console her and to share whatever thoughts he shared. And Bobby goes ballistic, the campaign manager. Right. Talk about that.
Well, Bobby went ballistic because he felt that it would piss off white voters, and they were concerned about losing Georgia. I mean,
which was a Democratic state.
Which is hard to believe, but was until now, and maybe it's coming back, and maybe there'll be a Democratic governor in Georgia. But that was, this was at a point where Georgia was still a cracker, Dixiecrat state. And the Kennedys were afraid that appearing with King or doing favors for King would antagonize the white vote. And Bobby Kennedy, ever pragmatic, was apoplectic that John Kennedy, at the advice of some of his civil rights advisors, was turning around and calling Coretta King. But then within a few hours, Bobby calls up the judge and says, "What is King doing in jail? Get him out of there." Completely inappropriate to call up the judge.
Sure.
But the judge gets a call from the president, the Democratic nominee's brother, and he hops to it, and King is sprung from jail. And it seems pretty clear that that's what elected John Kennedy president. Martin Luther King got Kennedy elected president.
I always thought, and maybe I'm going on folklore, I always thought it was the Daily Machine in Chicago.
Well, but see, Illinois wasn't the only state that was in play. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all of these other northern industrial states, the black vote was pivotal. And by going out and helping King and getting the word out, as the black community did, to the churches the Sunday before the Tuesday of the election, thousands and thousands of black votes were switched, including King's father. Daddy King was a Republican. Daddy King was a Nixon supporter until that moment when John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy got his son sprung from jail. And this is part of the contradiction of Robert Kennedy. As you said, he was absolutely infuriated that they reached out to King and thought it was a mistake for them to do it. And then within a space of a few hours, he acted on his own to get King out of jail. Bobby Kennedy was a complicated guy. Bobby Kennedy had different kinds of competing instincts. And part of the trick of writing about him is to disentangle these complications and even to try to figure out and to discredit the disinformation in a way that Robert Kennedy put out about himself. Robert Kennedy liked to think of himself as pragmatic and tough and not a softy and not a liberal. Even if he had some of these instincts, for some reason, he wanted to convince the world that he was tougher than that.
Yeah, he didn't. I mean, you make the point several times. I mean, he really wanted to avoid, in those days anyway, the label liberal.
Yeah.
I mean, that was not who he thought he was. And there's a lot of reason for us to believe that he wasn't. When you look at, he believed in the Red Scare. He worked for McCarthy, Senator McCarthy. He becomes Attorney General under his brother, which appalled Martin Luther King.
Yeah, this is completely forgotten.
And proceeds to approve Hoover, the FBI chief Hoover's, program to wiretap and surveil Martin Luther King. He has to go to the Attorney General for approval for
Right.
that, and Bobby says, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Bobby signed it, I think, without really giving it a lot of thought. You know, and there's this revisionist school of thought propagated by Arthur Schlesinger, the Kennedy historian, that they were doing this to protect King, you know, to clear King of charges that he was a communist, and to defeat Hoover, to outmaneuver Hoover by proving, since the taps would show nothing about King's communist associations, that they could actually clear him, and it would protect him to wiretap him.
That seems tortured logic.
It's very tortured logic, and I interviewed Martin Luther King's lawyer, longtime lawyer Clarence Jones, and all it took was one phone call, and he said that's just nonsense. That was not the term that he used. To him, that explanation was just nonsense. Again, it goes back to the Kennedys' pragmatism. They had to manage King. They had to know what was going on with King, and it suited them to wiretap him. It helped them to wiretap him. Now,
do you think you say Bobby signed the order without giving much thought to it? Do you really think he didn't think what the effects of this would be? I mean, here's a guy who probably understood, or should have understood, what Harry Belafonte told you, that the red baiting, the red scare, McCarthy's whole campaign was considered racist in the black community, and because so many of the black leaders had been either actual communists or thought to be.
Right. I think that he felt that it wouldn't come out for many years. It suited him at the time to do it. And if you read an oral history that he gave to the Kennedy Library to Anthony Lewis, the New York Times columnist, in late 1964, he sort of describes it, I signed a wiretap. He makes it sound as if it was not that big a deal for him to do it, and that he didn't agonize unduly over it. And that it was just a matter of protecting the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration had a lot of things to do far beyond civil rights, and they didn't want any surprises. And keeping tabs on Martin Luther King would help assure that there would be no surprises.
We were talking a minute ago that President Kennedy's appointment of his brother as the Attorney General appalls Martin Luther King, but his moral center, his tactical center says, he and his leaders get together and it's like, what are we going to do? This guy.
Yeah, that's really
But Martin Luther King gives them a charge to, make the best out of it.
Yeah, that's really an extraordinary story. It's a story that Harry Belafonte talks about in his memoirs, and that he spoke about with me, where King gathered his key advisors and said in so many words, this man, we don't like this man. It's a disaster that he was named Attorney General, but he's going to be our conduit to the president. He's going to be the man who handles civil rights. We have to learn to work with him. Go out and find me his moral center, and don't come back until you do. We have no choice. Make this work.
What did they find?
I don't think that they found what they were looking for. I mean, they found a very tough guy that was not going to be easy to deal with, and somebody that didn't necessarily have a great sort of instinctive record on civil rights. But they eventually found somebody who would listen to them, and who was sort of wanted to make things work, and was more engaged on civil rights than his brother was. And more interested in finding out what the black community cared about, more interested in meeting with them. I mean, there's a story in the book, there's a whole chapter in the book about his extraordinary meeting with James Baldwin in June of 1963, May of 1963, where he gathers all these black intellectuals, James Baldwin, Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Lorraine Hansberry, and basically says, tell me what's on your mind. And really, I can't imagine there was another white leader in the country at the time who would have done something like that. Now, of course, it turned out to be a disaster. Yeah. And there's a whole story about that. There was a freedom rider named Jerome Smith, whom I interviewed, who'd been very, very badly beaten in the South, and was in New York getting medical treatment nearly a year and a half after his beating down south, who sort of stood up to Bobby Kennedy in that meeting and said, we don't care about all these things, these promises that you're making and these nostrums that you're putting out. You're not protecting us. You're encouraging us to go out and register to vote, but when we do that, we get the crap beaten out of us. Where are you? Where's the Justice Department? And he stood up to Bobby Kennedy, and things got very tense, and everybody else felt liberated enough to dump on Bobby Kennedy, and Kennedy felt very betrayed by this. And again, this is part of...
Who are these people?
Who are the... How dare
to me like these...
Yeah, how dare these people talk to me when this administration is doing more for the Negro community than any administration since Lincoln's? How dare they talk to me like this? And he's very put out, and he denigrates them afterwards, and he makes ad hominem attacks on several of the people at the meeting. But then within a few days, he has second thoughts and third thoughts. And he thinks, if I were that poor freedom rider, I don't blame him for feeling the way that he does. I might feel the same way if I were in his position. And within a few days, he speaks to his brother and encourages his brother to give the famous civil rights speech that you remember and I remember from June of 1963, where John Kennedy finally gets on television.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
It's quite clear that he made that speech only because Bobby Kennedy encouraged him to. So there is a case where Bobby's best instincts and his worst instincts go to war with one another, and the best instincts win out.
It's implicit in everything we've been saying so far, but we should bring it out explicitly. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were never on equal footing. King was, in effect, a supplicant to this administration figure, Bobby who could do things for the civil rights as movement and leaders as he was doing in this case. And King having to go, not exactly hat in hand, I would imagine, but King having to ask him for favors. And it's kind of an unequal, the footing between the two of them was very precarious.
Yeah, I think that's right. I say that, when the two of them spoke to one another, it was always King who said please and thank you. And Bobby Kennedy had not all of the cards. As the 1960 election revealed, King had certain political powers, right. And King was going to help determine what the Kennedys' legacy was, and the Kennedys, of course, were very conscious of that. So he wasn't without power and influence, but it was absolutely as disproportionate as you say, and King was the supplicant. And that never really changed.
We have two men prominent in history, prominent at the time, with their causes, and we've been detailing it. They weren't friends. They weren't close. They barely spoke. There was no real connection between them, and the reasons why. And yet, the gorgeous scene you have early in the book, I think it's in the introduction, on the night that Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, and Bobby is running for president and is in Indiana, he gives a poetic and eloquent speech that I think nobody thought he had in him. He had never talked publicly about Martin Luther King. And yet here in this moment of disaster for the country and especially for the African American community, he's on television with an eloquent speech about.
Well, there's an amazing
we're going to get to the Lorraine Motel.
Yeah, that's right. There's just this amazing scene that Andrew Young described to me that I put at the very beginning of the book, where it deserves to be, right. Where he describes how after King was shot and declared dead, and they all left the hospital, they wanted to meet to discuss, all of King's disciples really wanted to discuss where are we going to go from here? What the hell are we going to do? And they all went back to the Lorraine Motel, and where else were they going to go? And they actually convened in King's motel room. This was a story that Andrew Young had never told before. It's not even in his memoirs. And Young described to me how what they wanted to do was get on television that night and talk to Black America, talk to the Black communities that were going up in flames around the country that night, and say, this is not what Dr. King would have wanted you to do, but that no one wanted to interview them. Everybody was more concerned about sort of interviewing the rioters than about talking to them. And how sitting in that motel room that night, they watched Robert Kennedy come over on the television, and they actually were watching the speech from Indianapolis, and how grateful they were to see Robert Kennedy getting out the message that they wanted to get out that night, but that no one wanted to speak with them about.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are Black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, Black people amongst Blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love.
Interesting also that this eloquent eulogy by Bobby on the night of Martin Luther King's assassination, see, first time and only time he talked publicly of Martin Luther King. 2 months later, Bobby, for the rest of the campaign, he never talked about it.
Yeah, that was amazing to me. I mean, what was amazing to me was that he had not spoken about him before for reasons that we've discussed. I mean, he just didn't want to embrace him too much. Even at the end, even when Bobby Kennedy was a favorite in the Black community, and Bobby Kennedy and King were really working towards the same things, even then, there was no sort of rapprochement or reunion between the two of them, because, I mean, it's largely forgotten now, but the King of 1968 was not the King of 1963. He wasn't the I Have a Dream King anymore. He'd become a much more radicalized figure, you know. He was urging American withdrawal from Vietnam long before Robert Kennedy did.
He was eroding his own base.
Right, and criticizing the American role in the world and American capitalism and really American culture in a way that Robert Kennedy could never have embraced. So even at the very end, Robert Kennedy kept his distance from him. Then you have this one aberrant moment in Indianapolis, the night that King is killed, the only time really where Robert Kennedy spoke at length about Martin Luther King publicly. And then the next day, the campaigning was called off until King's funeral a few days later. But Kennedy gave a speech the next morning before the campaign was suspended. He gave a speech in Cleveland about violence. And it's one of his most famous speeches, not as famous as the speech in Indianapolis, but one of his conventional, eloquent speeches written by someone else, unlike the speech in Indianapolis that he gave from his heart, his own words. And in this speech on violence in Cleveland the next day, decrying American violence, How can you speak about violence the day after Martin Luther King is murdered and not mention King by name? How can you do that? And why would you do that? But that's what happened. And you're quite right that he never really mentioned King. He wanted King's support. And King, it's an extraordinary thing, but King didn't hold the wiretapping against Kennedy. And King was prepared, even though he had never endorsed anyone, to endorse Robert Kennedy in 1968 for the presidency. But notwithstanding all of that, Kennedy still kept his distance from King right until the very end.
I began this program talking about, echoes of 68 here in 2018. I mean, so many of the issues are still on the table: racial divide, ideological divide. And you quote Representative John Lewis as saying, when these two men were murdered, Bobby and Martin, something died in all of us. We were robbed of part of our future. I think that we can agree on, and I'm very grateful that you wrote this book, David.
Well, thank you, Tony, and it's wonderful discussing it with someone like you.
Well, thank you. You need to read this, The Promise and the Dream, David Margolick. Thank you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.